unfortunately, the evidence doesn't tell me what Bob was doing. So if I'm really going to be strict about, I want to work with the best evidence only, the film doesn't tell me what Bob was doing when Roger was chasing Patty. You know, he was there, of course, he was witnessing it, but it doesn't tell me he was at this point in time, or at this location, or such like that. So the fact that I won't be mentioning Bob much in this particular presentation is in no way a reflection to suggest that his participation that day wasn't every bit as important as Roger's. Just happened Roger was the one holding the camera, so the camera tells me what Roger was doing. All right. Now, another thing when you're working with excellent evidence, you have to question everything. You want to make sure every piece of evidence has the most solid possible foundation. And I'm going to be talking about the film, I'm going to be talking about the camera that Roger was using. It's always been reported that Roger had a Kodak K100 camera, which looks like one of these. But I wanted to know for certain the very best possible evidence that that's the camera, because the analysis would hinge on it. And what I found out in my research is there's something called a camera identification mark, which does exist on a lot of film, because a lot of camera makers in the 30s and 40s and 50s of the last century would make these unusual shapes and forms in the aperture window or the aperture plate of the camera, and each one would produce a very distinctive shape or form, and it would actually embed image data into the film. Now, this is outside the projection area, so a standard projected movie, you'd never see it. But if you examine the film, for most cameras, it's there. And this first thing I'm going to show you here, you look over here at the top one there, that funny little thing where it goes into the sprocket area and comes back out in the middle and goes in again. That's the camera ID for Bell & Howell Kodak, or Bell & Howell 200 magazine camera, is that configuration of space, a block, and then a space. You look up over on the right here, that triangle that's between the two sprockets, that's a Bell & Howell film 070. You find that on a film, that's the camera that was used. Now, Kodak does it also. They have a magazine camera called the Sin Kodak, and it has a curved shape that comes around like this. If that's the shape you've got, you know that's the camera. And finally, an older one that Kodak made around 1930s, the Kodak Sin Kodak Model K, that has a circle and a square right underneath each other. Okay. These are examples of camera ID marks. Not every camera had them, but those that do, if they have the mark, you can look at the film and you know to an absolute certainty what kind of camera was used. Let me step over here real quick. Now, this is the aperture plate on the top of the K100 camera, and if you look in the lower right corner, you see there's a funny little curved thing that's kind of carved out of it. That's the camera ID for a Kodak K100 model. Now, if you look at, sorry about this.
You're forgiven.
All right, this is from some bench testing of the camera, and that little curvature that's in the bottom actually ends up on the upper left corner when you turn the camera right side up, because the lens flips the image down and the film runs upside down. So to look at it right, you have to rotate it. So that little curvature that's up in the upper corner is what you're going to find on any film that's shot with a Kodak K100 camera. Now we go to the transparency, one of them that Roger had Kodak make for him, from his camera originals, one of the first things that he did, and lo and behold, in this particular one, here is this curved shape. I kind of magnified it and kicked up the contrast a little bit, so here is that same curvature right here that's in that film. That is, in my opinion, the single most absolute conclusive evidence this is the camera. This is the kind that Roger used. And this would be literally forensic evidence to 100% certainty. So if I start talking about this camera, nobody can say, how do you know it's the one? Are we really sure? Done deal. This is absolute empirical evidence. Now the reason I bring this up as a point of reference is that there are things about this camera that are very, very relevant to what happened that day, as I'll be explaining to you. In the book that I just put out, and Tom was gracious enough to mention, it's called When Roger Meets Betty, there is one chapter on how the event occurred. I believe it's chapter 6. And it breaks down the film into 6 segments when Roger turned the camera on, off, and such, all the way through the film, and explains what he was doing there. Now, I feel that in the book, I explained it as well as text and as well as the black and white illustrations can confirm. But the truth of the matter is, there are some things that happened that day that just can't be explained very well in a text form or with a few black and white illustrations. They need an actual 3D live demonstration. That's what I'm going to be doing for you today. To explain what happened that day, but with the added bonus going beyond what the book could do, of actually being able to demonstrate things, especially with this particular camera. Okay. Now, there's a few things I just want to take a moment to acquaint you with this camera a little bit. Takes a 100-foot load in here, has single lens, single eyepiece, an adjustment here for your film speed from 16 frames up to 34, a wind crank that winds it up, and the spring inside this camera happens to be the largest, most powerful spring that has ever been put into a wind-up motion picture camera. It will run 40 feet of film. That's like about, at 24 frames, somewhere around 1 minute and 30 seconds or 1 minute and 40 seconds. Most wind-up cameras only take 20 to 30 seconds, so this runs like 3 times longer than most of your wind-up cameras do. Kodak actually deliberately did that because they wanted to market this more on the professional end, where they could run longer sequences than a normal wind-up does. It's one of the reasons they designed it that way. It does make it a very big camera, and it does make it a very heavy camera, though. Now, here's the actual shutter mechanism, or the trigger. Okay. When it's sitting in this normal position, that's off. If you push it up, it will take 1 frame of film, even no matter how long you hold it. It just takes 1 frame and stops. That's for time-lapse photography or stop-motion photography or such like that. If you push the lever down in the first position, the camera turns on. Can we hear that? Hear that? Camera turns on, but it will only run as long as you hold it down. As soon as you let it go, trigger pops back up, turns it off. That's first position down. Second position down, however, you take your finger off the trigger and it's still running. It will run until I do either the spring runs out of tension or I push the trigger back up myself. So we have these different positions, and this also is somewhat relevant to what's going on. Now, the standard way you're using this camera, you're holding it by this hand, you're bracing it, and you're shooting through here, looking through here, and you're holding your hand like so for the trigger. Your thumb here isn't really supporting the camera, it's just kind of bracing the hand that's going to pull the trigger down, up and down, and stuff like that. But basically, this hand is the one that's holding it. Now, it's a little bit awkward because you can hold it this way, but believe me, it gets a little tiring on your wrist. But you can't grip it absolutely securely. Now, if I were to turn it upside down and my fingers were a little bit moist or the casing was a little bit moist, it could drop out of my hand. If I'm holding it this way, same thing. It could